Hello viewers, I am Zach Hardy with the Wrestle Target and Dustin Bloodies Dwayne. Simon Saint does his best Tanya Harding impersonation, Crosby Thorne in Chain Reaction up the ante, and Zach Hardy redefines the meaning of a heel. All this and more on the October 17th, 2018 edition of USW Wednesday Night Intensity in a nutshell. So we open up the show, of course, taking place in Atlantic City, New Jersey, the host from what was USW Hellfire this past Sunday. And we started out with what everybody kind of took away most and first and foremost from USW Hellfire, though that was even addressed in the promo, with Zach Hardy walking out to describe his actions and, I guess, discuss them in further detail as to why he went into further actions this past Sunday with his attack on James after the main event match. Zach Hardy pretty much just went into not even defense mode, but explanation territory. He talked about how, is it really considered turning heel if, or is turning heel really considered turning heel when you're turning heel for turning your back on the fans despite the fact that they turned their back on you first? It kind of brings a new meaning towards heel and face. He mentioned and made reference to the fact that for the past 30, 40, 50 years in pro wrestling, you've either been looked at as a heel or a face. Nowhere in between, because then you eventually have to choose a side, and nowhere else. There's no further, more concrete, in-depth description of a face or a heel. And he described himself as a flex heel, somebody that is looked very, very, very overwhelmingly like a heel, though has justified reasons for doing what he did to become a heel on the fan side to begin with. Something that I don't think anybody's ever really touched on in pro wrestling. They've kind of made their own defense, but never really went into the case as to why they aren't a heel. It's, I guess, more so a case where it's like a flex heel is someone who is overwhelmingly looked at as a heel, though has a reason for why he's a heel. And the explanation that Hardy gave was absolutely perfect. He's looked at as a heel right now because he turned his back on the locker room and on the fans, though described the fact that the fans and the locker room pushing him and shoving him into corners that he should not have been in because of the fact that he was not attributed with the vigilante group before this past Sunday and his actions. They sort of already set the stone in motion for them turning on him. So he kind of described it as more of a self-defense sort of thing, and it really made a lot of people wonder. And I saw a little bit of activity on social media of the question of, well, this probably is the biggest defense for face versus heel, and for why it's not as simple as it sounds. So if you have any description on whether a heel can be justified in his actions, and if that makes him less or more of a heel, or nothing other than just a straight-up heel, let me know in the comments down below. He went on eventually to release the statement as to why the vigilante group has been going on for the past couple of months, and now that he is involved as their leader, their de facto stable leader, I guess, he's described that their mission statement is essentially to become the most powerful entity on the USW Wednesday Night Intensity roster. He went into detail about how that doesn't necessarily mean that they want to win a bunch of matches or win a bunch of championships, but they want to be the overwhelming power trip. He described it perfectly as he wants there to be a case where nobody can hold a higher level of power over them. And he described the fact that it's something that's a little bit different, since a lot of stables tend to go for the championships and the wins right out of the gate. He went into the fact that they don't need to win championships at the moment. They don't want to win championships at the moment. They have the USW Tag Team Championships. They have the Red Belt Championship. Their mission for there is to keep it, but at the same time, winning a bunch of matches and gaining higher status for each individual in the group gives them all a collective bigger stature in terms of the overall picture, the World Championship picture, main event picture, so on and so forth. Kind of gives everybody a collective reasoning for the group, but also kind of builds them up one by one, especially pushing over the fact that the Stargazers and Chain Reaction are tag team and Red Belt champions respectively, and therefore he kind of built them up as guys that now are past phase 1 and into phase 2, which is keeping that success and moderating their success, while everybody else kind of focused on gaining their own separate entities of success, which is a beautiful, and I mean beautiful, equation for success. And the funny thing was that he went into detail with what their mission statement was and about how it wasn't just about winning championships, but ensuring that power wasn't held over them by anybody else. And he made names, of course, or references to names like the Reese Family Organization, the Reese family themselves, and he had higher up board members, and especially Rose Lyon. He made sure to kind of make sure her name was a little bit stated in a different verbal tone than the rest of them. So it kind of signifies the lengths that he is willing to go to ensure that this vigilante group succeeds. And the final touch to take away from the opening segment, a very jam-packed opening segment, despite the fact that it was only really given 10 minutes of promo time, which for Zach Hardy is a rarity, was the fact that the vigilante group is now no longer going to be known as the vigilante group, and rather be known and collectively run by and run as Metric. So Metric is now the group's name, which kind of makes perfect sense. Metric is essentially the kind of well, I mean, they didn't describe it too perfectly in the overall promo, but I guess the big way to take away from it was the fact that they were on one straight track toward success. They had their goal in mind. They can end up getting diverted from that goal, but eventually they find themselves back on the right path, on the right track, and therefore gave themselves the fast track in terms of knowing where they're going towards their success, which I guess gave the overall definition to Metric, though I guess they kind of wanted to branch away from the fact that their theme song is Black Sheep by Metric, so it becomes a little bit confusing, and I can only imagine some of the guys that get involved on like their Wikipedia pages, like Chain Reaction, you see his theme songs, and then you see Black Sheep by Metric used while in Metric, and you're like, well, wait, did Metric perform the song as well, and is that same band also Metric the group? It can get really confusing, especially with the fact that Zach Hardy name-dropped Metric as the Black Sheep of Ultimate Showcase Wrestling's stable history, which, well, just makes it all even more confusing. So when it comes down to it, it was a great promo to start out everything, especially with the fact that it was able to incorporate so much and collect it all together. And I think that's the one thing that Zach Hardy does beautifully with his promos, is that when he goes into a subject, even if he starts veering off the subject and off the topic, he makes that veered off topic connect with the overall original topic. He never branches out and just continues around. He just brings it right into one big circle, which is, well, overall, I guess a very telling sign as to what Metric's mission statement is. So I guess it's a great takeaway. Then we get from the opening promo into the first match, which was Benny Franklin versus Weiler. Fun match, obviously quicker because of the fact that Intensity is a 2-hour show, and they've got a lot to jam-pack in terms of building up, especially Bulletproof 11, which they definitely started tonight. Weiler ended up picking up the victory over Benny Franklin with the Y, aka the Spear to the back. Benny Franklin, obviously, as Weiler was celebrating up the ramp, did not look very pleased visually, as you would expect once he lost the match, but it kind of sets in motion an idea for Benny Franklin and Weiler to kind of have this overarching feud until Lesnar Kills comes back, or until Benny Franklin and Weiler do elsewhere. Honestly, if I'm gonna kind of be straightforward with you, I'm just glad that Weiler and Seth is over. Anyway, we go from there to a segment with Derrick Carter walking throughout the backstage area, going towards his locker room. That's a spider or not. Anyway, we go back into Derrick Carter walking backstage, trying to get to his locker room, and then you automatically see him just get attacked from the someone insane is revealed to be beating down Derrick Carter backstage. He throws him through a table, picks him back up, puts him on like a kind of leveraged ground, gets off of an incline from the backstage area and hits a swanton bomb on Derrick Carter. He obviously holds his back after the segment, so I'm fairly certain that that's obviously a work, but nevertheless kind of adds fuel and tension to Simon Saint versus Derrick Carter, which I think is a feud that's really been lacking a lot of attention. That spider's just annoying me. My apologies. 1 second. Okay. Done. Then the second match on the card is Carson Andrews versus Mr. Anthony. Now, obviously, we get the impression that it's Mr. Anthony and Carson Andrews, a guy that's usually been utilized for or as enhancement talent, and Mr. Anthony, a guy that's still trying to get into the Blue Belt Championship picture. And Mr. Anthony obviously beats Carson Andrews in this match, but what happens afterwards makes well, his feud quite complicated overall. And that is Dwayne Porter ends up walking out after Mr. Anthony calls out Dwayne Porter for getting lucky, essentially, over this past Sunday at Hellfire and wants a rematch for the Blue Belt Championship. Now, obviously, let's just take a look at who's in the championship picture already. Dwayne Porter, Mr. Anthony, Tyreek Carver, they are the mainstays. Simon Saint was for a while. I guess he's doing his thing with Derrick Carter, but we'll leave it in here, especially considering Derrick Carter. I would not count him out of being involved in the Blue Belt Championship picture in some way. Hernasli was as well. We still don't know what the overall kind of direction with Hernasli is, and if he'll be coming back anytime soon. We haven't heard anything from that. But nevertheless, I believe we gotten down Mr. Anthony, but now we also have to get down Dustin Raymond, because after the match, when Mr. Anthony calls out Dwayne Porter comes out to talk about whatever, drops the Blue Belt Championship to start walking down the ramp. The crowd goes crazy. Dwayne Porter turns around, my apologies, and the cameras just watch him get cold-cocked over the head with the Blue Belt Championship held by Dustin Raymond, who tries to essentially decapitate Dwayne Porter with his own championship belt. Camera cuts back to Dwayne Porter after a very visually upset and distressed Dustin Raymond gets a little bit of camera time to view that Dwayne Porter has been busted open. I wouldn't say lacerated, but it was definitely more blood than you would expect on a weekly show. Not that you would expect any blood on a weekly show, which made this segment a little bit more special. Dustin Raymond then starts beating down on Dwayne Porter until security and referees try to convince him, and ultimately do convince him, to stop the assault. Mr. Anthony just stands in the ring watching and essentially noticing that the championship picture has grown even more harsh and difficult to succeed in. So Dwayne Porter and Dustin Raymond are now, I guess, in this blood feud. I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Anthony was implemented in it as well, since he was kind of the source as to why it started to begin with, but nevertheless, it's kind of fun to watch it all unfold, and the fact that they're calling back Dwayne Porter and Dustin Raymond in the Blue Belt Championship picture just brings back all the nostalgia. So we get into that, we go into a Martin Brothers interview by Nathan Greenway, and the Martin Brothers essentially state that they're going after the USW Tag Team Championships. That was the overall message from the interview, but a little portion in the interview stated that George Martin wanted to say something, and Alex Martin cut him off before he wanted to say something. George Martin was like, "Hey, I was trying to say something." And George Martin continues on, and the promo goes on like that. So again, as I said from last Sunday's Hellfire pay-per-view, they're kind of starting to sow the seeds of a Martin Brothers split. And the fact that they're gunning after the USW Tag Team Championships, and it doesn't seem like they're getting anywhere close to that, only signifies that it's down to a few months, perhaps, before the Martin Brothers officially split. This is absolutely the start of the ripple and the split between Alex Martin and George Martin. So that's, I guess, a wonderful piece of character development. Afterwards, we get into Xavier King and Zach Arden of the Wine Cellar. They beat MP45, which is the team that I guess has been lost in the shuffle in the Intensity Tag Team division over the past number of months. Ever since they lost the Tag Team Championships to the Marvelous Brothers in Arms. At least I think that was the team that they lost it to. I'm pretty sure that was the match at Call to Greatness a couple of months ago. I could be wrong, but nevertheless, I digress. We go back, and Xavier King and Zach Arden with Norris Cadaveri in their corner. The Wine Cellar pick up the victory over MP45. Now, obviously, this hinders MP45 again, which really does suck a lot. But we kind of get this overwhelming feeling of the fact that MP45 is going to start this kind of climb up, and at the same time, Xavier King and Zach Arden and Norris Cadaveri, the Wine Cellar, now with Metric involved, the Promised Land coming to Wednesday Night Intensity fairly soon, and on top of all of that, they've kind of got this little position that they're in which they don't really have an identity. They're like the mobocracy of the Intensity brand. This push is gonna, or at least this win could signify anything from a push to just a filler match on Intensity, so we'll have to kind of wait and see and not dig too deep into that without any more information. Then we get a quick interview with Haley Auster with Nathan Greenway, who essentially talks about her loss to her Equinox this past Sunday at Hellfire. She states that it was a minor bump in the road. Her Equinox is a talented performer. She gives her a bunch of credit, kind of puts her over to an extent, but states that while the ban on her being able to challenge for the USW Women's Championship in 2018 is still going on, she is fighting as hard as possible with as much heart as humanly possible to ensure that by the time 2019 rolls around, she has the quality and the status to be considered a challenger and a contender to the USW Women's Championship, which is a big deal. It's kind of a case of USW saying, hey, we understand that this storyline has started, it's developed, now we've got to kind of get into the process now. And they're trying to book it the right way 3 months out and already start sowing the seeds, which gives me hope, because some of the best storylines that USW has produced over the past number of years since it started and its inception in 2013 have been the ones that were booked and planned out and sort of slow-boiled 3, 4, 5 months out. The whole Martin Brothers split in 2014 was a big case. Weiler versus Zach Hardy in 2015 was a big case. In 2016, the whole feud between, the whole build-up and feud between James and Morbid and the build-up of James into a USW Championship contender was done in that way. In 2017, we kind of got the build-up of Ezra Kills and Benny Franklin. 2018 was the year of James and the championship run, so a lot of these brilliant things and pieces of booking and feuds and strategic planning have been done months out in advance. So if that is the case, then Haley Auster versus Alicia Sinclair should be fantastic. And I think it's a brilliant way to kind of get people to understand and kind of wrap their mind around the fact that not every feud has to be set from one end to one end, and you're just waiting for that other end to take place. Everybody assumes that Alicia Sinclair versus Cindy Allison Jackson is going to be the match that eventually ends Sinclair's championship reign, and I appreciate the fact that USW and Intensity are doing their best to ensure that people can assume that Peyton Hawthorne, but we'll get to that in a second, and Haley Auster and Jade Oliver can also be viable contenders to take that title off of Alicia Sinclair. I said appreciate because I don't think it's going to happen, but I can appreciate and admire the effort that they're putting into that. Nevertheless, it was a great segment. Then we come into the second Zach Hardy segment of the night, because you can never get more Hardy than asked for. Just kidding, you get more Hardy than you ask for every fucking week. I love you, USW, but you overuse me. I'm just kidding. That's going to cause a fucking stir, because people are not going to be happy with me saying that. How well, last year you held the USW title and never fucking defended it? Excuse yourself now, bitch! Hey, don't blame me. I just impersonated you two. I'll be fine with that. We get into the James and Zach Hardy segment. I guess, if we're being honest, Zach Hardy was kind of a big factor and was going to be a big factor of the Intensity for October 17th, because he did have to answer for his actions against James, and he had also speak on behalf of Metric. He had to lay the groundwork for the stable as a whole. He's really... on top of that, then he's got, the whole feud with James. He's got the explanation for that. He's got to kind of have to defend himself against James, defend himself against the crowd. He's going to have to kind of put all these inner workings together. So he's got a lot of purpose towards this show, and I think it was done very well. But at the same time, it's kind of like a case that when you take away something from every Intensity, I think that if you take away something from October 17th's 2018 edition of Intensity, you'll take away the fact that Zach Hardy has really been put into a position in which he's setting up a litany of different long-term storylines. The Metric storyline, the Zach Hardy versus James continuation storyline, the main event storyline, now the de facto, from the case that the fans were very receptive of it, and I don't think that was the case to begin with, but now they're very receptive of the fact that now he's kind of giving a new definition to heels and faces with a fixed heel and a fixed face. I think that's kind of a case where he's got a lot writing on him on Intensity and with USW, and I think obviously he's going to do fantastic with it, but it's more of a case in which I think that you take away from the fact that he's going to be a mainstay of the show for months to come and well out beyond Call to Greatness 14 in Chicago next year. So the story, or the segment essentially goes, James comes out, begs the question as to why Zach Hardy did what he did on Sunday, took away, or kind of made reference to the fact that at the top of the show he stated that the roster and the crowd turned their back towards Hardy, and kind of, I guess, sympathized to an extent, which is different, because I don't think that was, again, overall the original message. I think that Hardy setting a new tone for heels and faces and people kind of gravitating towards that influenced the decision to kind of have it be a more sympathetic kind of case. I think that had a big thing to do with it, but he kind of sympathized with the fact of, understanding where Hardy was coming from with 10 years going on, and feeling like you're at a stalemate for a number of years. He states that it can be understandable thinking that the fans have turned against you once they find somebody new. And he actually kind of admits a little bit of guilt for putting all this pressure on Zach Hardy and the rest of the roster doing so, and automatically assuming that he had something to do with Metric. And he can see that the big reason for why this past Sunday happened was because of that case. But nevertheless, he wants an overall answer as to why he did it, knowing that it's kind of a case that it could have just dissipated, but he allowed it to eat into him, and now it's a whole thing. So Zach Hardy comes out, talks about or runs down a litany of different things. The fact that it's not as much as that the crowd has moved on from him and gone to James, but it's that the crowd has not only gone from him to James, but they've also kind of negated everything that Zach Hardy had done for them for years. He stated that, and people get annoyed of him stating this very often, but he stated that while he always says that USW was made because of him, and he helped USW kind of become a thing with WOW, and helped professionalize and legitimize the company and the Reese family organization. At the same time, he states that very often because he wants to remind everybody, and feels like not everybody reminds themselves enough, that they're so easy to overlook his accomplishments, despite the fact that he's the reason for why they're even having a show to talk about to begin with. And the fact that they were so easy to not only move on from him, but to move on from him and negate everything that he's done is obviously like a swift kick in the nuts. He also states the fact that the main roster, it goes deeper than him being portrayed as this villain. It's a lack of trust and a lack of ethic, despite the fact that he had been in or under the Reese family umbrella for much longer than 99% of the USW roster itself. And I think he stated something along the lines of that Derrick, Carter, Morbid, Majigeta, and Cannon are the only guys in USW left that were there before Zach Hardy got there, which is weird to imagine because, I mean, the roster has, 60 to 90 individuals, and only 4 of them have been there longer than Zach Hardy, who, may I remind you, is only 18 fucking years old. That's absolutely insane to kind of think about, but nevertheless, when you put it into context, it's kind of a case of he's been there for so long, and everybody refused to believe him. Everybody from the higher ups that had kind of been given a job because of the success that he portrayed, the roster that he helped nurture into positions that they were in now, and on top of that, the overwhelming lack of distrust from people like Roseline, who he had been so close with. It was not only just a swift kick in the nuts, but kind of like a punch in the face and a spit on the ground, and expected to take that with thank you. It makes Zach Hardy out to be a sympathetic babyface, which is extremely weird because he's a heel. And that transpires towards the end of the feud, where James states, hey, I get that, I understand that, but these people moved on from you for a reason. Because eventually, as you've stated many times before, there's always going to be success for an individual until somebody comes along and does what that individual does better than that individual does what that individual does. Meaning that everybody will love Zach Hardy until somebody like James comes along and does what Zach Hardy does better than Zach Hardy can do what Zach Hardy does. It's very strange. But nevertheless, this overwhelming saying is they moved on from Zach Hardy because James kept beating Zach Hardy, and James was just the better performer. And you obviously go to the better performer or you follow the better performer when you're having to follow stories, because that better performer is going to be in a better story than the person beforehand. And he didn't take too kindly to this. James challenged Zach Hardy to a match at Bulletproof 11 for the USW Championship, setting in motion the main event of the show, and Zach Hardy agreed, went to turn around, but then immediately just wiped off James from like the face of the fucking planet with the discus lariat, and then held up the championship in his arms and just tossed it back onto James before leaving the ring. So, again, as I said, he's being built up as this sympathetic babyface, but he's such a downright despicable heel. It's kind of the case of, at the top of the show, he established that, yeah, he's a heel, but he's a flex heel, you know, or a fixed heel. He's a flex heel. He's a guy that is overwhelmingly looked at as a bad guy or as a heel, despite the fact that he's justified in doing so. And he's justified because the fans justified it for him, or the roster justified it for him. He's a heel because of everybody else, but everybody else looks at him like it's his fault. So it's kind of like he's supposed to be this sympathetic, not even sympathetic, he's supposed to be this justified heel, which in essence is a sympathetic babyface. You know, it's like, it's weird because you're put in this really weird leeway where it's like you're supposed to feel bad for him, but at the same time, he can kick someone in the nuts and you're not supposed to feel bad for him, but you're not supposed to cheer him? It's this weird dimension, and I think if this flex heel thing kind of goes along for much further, it's going to have to be put into some kind of context, because he's being portrayed as a sympathetic babyface, but he's doing absolute 100% heel tactics. And it's just a really weird dimension to kind of be in, where is he heel? Is he face? But it's like he acts as a heel, but is the booking supposed to portray him as a heel or the face? I don't know. It's a confusing little middle ground, not even tweener, but a middle ground where you don't know what he is, and that's going to have to kind of be sorted out and processed. So I'm really looking forward to that over the next 6 weeks, that Hellfire is, you know, coming and going, and all the effects are portraying themselves and leewaying themselves into Bulletproof 11, which I think will be the overall conclusion and climax of the James and Zach Hardy story for now. Yeah, we move on from that because it's a lot to unpack. We move into Alicia Sinclair versus Peyton Hawthorne, and it's a fun main event match to close out the show. My one gripe with it is that Peyton Hawthorne now looks kind of dispensable. Or not dispensable, disposable. It's kind of like a weird case in which you want to cheer her and you want to believe she can face Alicia Sinclair, and she put on a good contest against Alicia Sinclair. Intensity main events are always really probably the most focused points of intensity, because it's the matches it's the match given the most time and the most effort in terms of booking. But Peyton Hawthorne ends up losing to Alicia Sinclair in about 18 minutes. Alicia Sinclair was on offense for the better half of the match, while Peyton Hawthorne made it competitive. There was never an instance in which you thought Peyton Hawthorne could win, which is a problem because you're supposed to be booking her up extremely well. She's supposed to be looking strong. She's supposed to be looking capable of beating Alicia Sinclair. And good offense on a team, good offense on a performer or as a competitor, doesn't always add up to success. You know, take the 49ers and Green Bay Packers game from this past Monday. I know a lot of you don't watch football, so let me just kind of break it down into easy terms. 49ers are a bad team, Packers are a mediocre team, but the Packers were supposed to destroy the 49ers. The 49ers made the game competitive. They only really lost at the final couple seconds of the game. But it's kind of telling, because the 49ers have won 1 game out of 6, so they lost 5 games. The Packers have won 2 games out of 6, have won 3 games out of 6, have lost 2, and have tied with 1. So it's kind of like a case of it's a mediocre individual. We'll just take the Packers and 49ers as single entities. It's a mediocre individual and a bad individual. But that bad individual can have a good showing, but unless they win and unless they do something, it doesn't change the fact that just because they had a good showing doesn't mean that it changes the fact that they're a bad individual. The 49ers are a very injury-riddled team. Their players have gotten hurt extremely over the past couple of weeks, and they have not won at all, really. They've won one game. They played all right, but when you look at the overall thing, they've won once. They're not a good team. They can't close it off. And that's the same thing with Peyton Hawthorne. She makes it competitive. She gets something done against an individual that is a pretty good team. I mean, Packers have Aaron Rodgers, and you've all heard of Tom Brady, and Aaron Rodgers is like on the same level, kind of like competitively, with Tom Brady. So obviously, Aaron Rodgers is really good. So the Packers are pretty good with Aaron Rodgers, right? That's what it's supposed to mean. But when it comes down to it, it doesn't change much unless they win. Because just because you have some good components to you does not necessarily mean you're good overall. And Peyton Hawthorne is a great competitor. She's a great performer. But I cannot look at Peyton Hawthorne right now and convince myself that she can beat Alicia Sinclair for the USW Women's Championship. She's won quite a few matches over the past couple of months. She's gotten really involved in the overall segments. She's gotten into a position where I think she could have a meaningful match against Alicia Sinclair for a championship on a pay-per-view. I don't think she'd win, but I'm convinced she could have a competitive match with her, right? So with the 49ers, I'm convinced that they could have a competitive match against another good team like the Chicago Bears, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'll think that they could win the game, right? Because that's not what a 1-5 record looks like, right? It means you're a bad team, but you can make things competitive. It means you're not going to win, but you can make it competitive. Peyton Hawthorne is a 1-5 individual and performer. She can make things competitive, but when it matters, she's not going to win. And that's what I see with Peyton Hawthorne and Alicia Sinclair. And it bugs me that they put this match on intensity. You know, they didn't build up to it. If anything, allow Alicia Sinclair and Peyton Hawthorne to have a match at Bulletproof for the championship. Don't put it on in intensity, because then if you're going to have Sinclair beat Peyton Hawthorne, it's going to diminish your stock. If anything, it's a non-title match. Have Peyton Hawthorne beat Alicia Sinclair. Then you have another viable contender for the Women's Championship. You can add her into the mix with Haley Auster and Cindy Allison Jackson and Jade Oliver. But you didn't do that. And that bugs the crap out of me, because now Peyton Hawthorne looks a little bit disposable. I'm not convinced anymore that she can beat Alicia Sinclair, because she was on a roll, she was putting on great matches, she was winning matches against talent that was getting better and better and better by the weeks, and eventually I got to the point where I was like, maybe if she were to face Alicia Sinclair tomorrow for the title, she could beat Alicia Sinclair. I don't think that anymore, because Alicia Sinclair pretty much held her own and then some against Peyton Hawthorne. And that's the worst booking decision I think they made on intensity, which, or at least tonight, which, I mean, is telling of how good the shows are, but at the same time, makes me a little less sold on Peyton Hawthorne. So I'm really hoping to get that right in the near future. Then we close off the show with a segment between Chain Reaction and Crosby Thorne. Crosby Thorne walks out to a huge applause. First appearance on a USW weekly show. It's the first time he's performed under a Reese Family Organization weekly show since 2012, which is already 6 years ago, over 6 years ago now, to the last time he competed on a WOW weekly show. That's just insane to think about. But nevertheless, Crosby Thorne comes out to a huge ovation. Kind of talks a little bit about how, even with the element of surprise, Chain Reaction managed to hold his own and beat Crosby Thorne this past Sunday. Really sings his praises, which is fantastic, because now Chain Reaction looks like the the dark horse candidate to make a real good run in Metric. Like, he's like the dark horse candidate to get a lot more done than you would ever expect him to do out of everybody in Metric, you know? So that's wonderful. Chain Reaction comes out, runs down the fact that he is the Red Belt champion for a reason. Just because he's not the USW champion or a world champion does not mean that he is not world championship material. Just because he's holding a tertiary championship does not mean that he is not world championship material. States the fact that Zach Hardy once held the blue belt championship despite the fact that he's a multi-time world champion. He's talked about how Derrick Carter has held the red belt championship, the extreme championship, despite always constantly being a world championship material performer. Just because you hold the championship that's not the world championship does not mean that you're not world championship material, which I think was beautiful, and I think is something that a lot of fans have been voicing a big opinion over for a long time. Even when championships are made to be a stepping ladder towards a higher goal, it does not necessarily mean that stepping ladder is not being utilized by the individuals that are very capable of getting that goal right out of the bat. It just means they're taking a longer road to it than utilizing their stature. My hand's blocking the light. But nevertheless, Chain Reaction runs down that, talks about how with Metric, it's a plot game, it's like a game of chess. They're waiting patiently and doing what needs to be done to overwhelmingly succeed in their efforts to become the most powerful entity in intensity, and he is as much of a main figure in that as Zach Hardy and Anarchy and Prophecy, because he has one thing that most people in Metric don't, and it is a championship to defend. He's already skipped round 1 and is now at round 2, which is defending and retaining that success and that entity of success for Metric. And that continues on no matter who it may be against, whether it may be Sunkissed, whether it may be Morbid, whether it may be the Durango dudes, or the Durango dudes, yeah. Or whether that may be Crosby Thorne. He can bring anybody from USW any night and have it be like a surprise return, which I'm interested in seeing if anything kind of comes from that quote. But nevertheless, Chain Reaction will overwhelm them all because he is world championship material. He is just holding up a championship that's not the world championship with the same amount of prestige and the same amount of hope and praise and care as the world championship. He then raises the title in the air. Crosby Thorne picks up a mic and says, "I don't need to bring anybody to surprise you. I don't need to surprise you. That just happened to be the case this past Sunday. Nevertheless, you can sing your praises all you want, and I can sing your praises all I damn well please. But never say die," which is obviously the old quote that Crosby Thorne utilized in WOW, and said that when it comes down to it, he will see Chain Reaction again with the red belt title on the line, and next time, Chain Reaction will not be as good as he was on Sunday. So, overwhelmingly, you set in motion Crosby Thorne versus Chain Reaction 2 for the red belt championship. You establish Chain Reaction as a dominant force and threat in Metric, and I'm loving it. Great fucking show. It's like you implement the best things from everything, and I'll tell you this much. When it comes down to running down the entire board of intensity from tonight, I don't think I've been impressed with anybody more so than I was with Chain Reaction. He was lost in the shuffle after the split with Indigo Child, along with Indigo Reaction back in 2015, I think it was, or 2016. And now I think he's really found his footing with Metric. And I think the fact that Chain Reaction and Seth and Arvo Black and Adrian Ritchie of the Stargazers, Anarchy, Prophecy, and Zach Hardy, now that they're all a collective force, I think there's only up for these guys. Anarchy and Prophecy have looked like hired mercenaries, which just makes them look very, very, very convincing threats to anything. Zach Hardy is obviously Zach Hardy. He's of a high stature himself, just period. Chain Reaction has now been Chain Reaction and the Stargazers now have championships within Metric that give them a high level and a high ceiling that they are skyrocketing towards, that kind of put them on even playing grounds with Metric. And even a guy like Seth, who's been lost in the shuffle with feuds like Weiler and so on and so forth, has been kind of reserved for the role of spoiler. Like, if it's like an Anarchy and Prophecy tag team match, Seth will get involved and kind of be like the sly guy of Metric. And everybody has their own identity, and they all have a purpose in the group. And I'll tell you this much, I've been a big fan of groups like the God Complex, the Promised Land, Wine Cellar. I think they've all had brilliant ideas and have been booked extremely well. I don't think, maybe that's just because I haven't seen a big group setting work ever since the blanking on the name. Perfect Destiny with Cannon back in 2013 was done, but I think Metric has the best chance to be something special and something unique and new and great, and I'm really looking forward to it. So that was Intensity from October 17th, 2018. Really enjoyed the show, pieced everything together collectively extremely well. Raymond and Porter was set up for Bulletproof, along with Mr. Anthony and the Shuffle. Simon Saint and Derrick Carter were set up for Bulletproof. Chain Reaction and Crosby Thorne look like they have a feud set for ages. James and Zach Hardy has a reason to be the main event of Bulletproof. I love putting my hands in position where they just stay there, and it looks fantastic on the screen. Benny Franklin and Weiler starts getting set up. The Wine Cellar looks fantastic. MP45 is given a direction. The Martin brothers have seeds being planted ever so slightly. Alicia Sinclair looks great. Peyton Hawthorne could look better. Haley Auster is sticking to her ideas. Her Equinox even looks great while she's not even on the show to begin with. It's all just extremely well, and Carson Andrews is still being paid for doing nothing. I'm just kidding. I love you, Carson. But nevertheless, that was October 17th, 2018. October 17th, 2018's edition of Intensity in a nutshell. A very long nutshell and a very convoluted nutshell, but nevertheless a nutshell to begin with. What were your thoughts on the show? Did you like it? Did you hate it? What are some of the things you could have done better? Some of the things you could have done worse? You can find me on Instagram at TheZackhardy. You can find me on Twitter at ZaCharYSERRA. Bitch! I am Zach Hardy. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more. My battery's dying. So, I'm Zach Hardy. I'm signing off.